Gabriel.
Thank you. It's my privilege to present to you the results of TAO on behalf of the TAO investigators. My disclosures are on this slide. The study was funded and sponsored by Sanofi. As pointed out by Dr. Frobert, thrombosis plays a key role in the genesis of acute coronary syndromes, whether they have ST elevation or non-ST elevation, and therefore anticoagulation is a key therapy for these conditions. However, there is no perfect accepted gold standard for anticoagulation in patients with ACS. There are 4 alternatives: fractionated heparin, bivalirudin, enoxaparin, fondaparinux, and they all have limitations. In fact, the fact that there is no gold standard is reflected in the extraordinary variation across countries and centers in the protocols for anticoagulation in ACS patients. Yet, ACS remains a life-threatening condition with a short-term morbid mortality that is pretty high. Otamixaban is a novel injectable factor Xa antagonist and has shown promise in a rather large phase 2 dose-ranging trial called CPI-ACS TIMI-42. That trial was more than 3,000 patients. And in that trial, there was a signal of efficacy at mid-range doses with little excess bleeding compared to a standard of fractionated heparin and a glycoprotein 2B receptor antagonist. And therefore, this prompted the design of this large phase 3 pivotal trial called TAO, which enrolled patients with moderate to high-risk non-ST elevation ACS and a planned early invasive strategy, which has become the standard nowadays for managing these patients. These patients received standard therapy, including dual antiplatelet therapy, and there was something unique in the design of TAO, that it was a 2-stage trial. In the first stage, patients were randomly assigned to 3 arms, either the control arm of heparin and eptifibatide, or one of 2 doses of Otamixaban with a bolus and an infusion regimen. And I failed to point out that Otamixaban is an injectable drug, and it has little renal elimination, a short half-life, and it's quick-acting. A pre-specified interim analysis by the DSMB allowed the DSMB, according to a predefined algorithm, to select which dose should continue enrollment up to the end of the trial. In other words, to select the best dose. And therefore, the DSMB played a key role in that trial, and 2 members of that DSMB are in the audience, Professor Michel Bertrand and Professor Harry Buehler, and I want to thank them because they had a very difficult and important role in that trial. They did this while keeping the investigators and the sponsor blinded. So we built a true firewall between the DSMB, who had knowledge of which arm was going forward, and all of us, investigators and sponsor, continuing enrollment. And the enrollment in the second stage continued until more than 5,000 patients had been enrolled in the 2 arms that went forward, the control arm and the best dose of Otamixaban. This was a double-blind, triple-dummy trial. You can imagine the logistic complexities related to doing that kind of a trial with injectable therapies in the acute setting. It was a difficult trial. The primary efficacy endpoint was death and MI at day 7. The primary safety endpoint was the combination of TIMI major and minor bleeds at day 7. The results are depicted here. On the left, you have the efficacy, death or MI, the Kaplan-Meier curves, and you can see that there is a complete overlap between the 2 curves with no difference in efficacy. And at day 7, the primary pre-specified efficacy endpoint time, the relative risk was 0.99. It doesn't get any closer than this. In contrast, safety was not good. There was a doubling of bleeding for the primary safety endpoint. In fact, there was a doubling of bleeding according to any bleeding endpoint and any bleeding classification, whether we looked at TIMI, Gusto, BARC, etc. So the agent is not superior. It failed to meet superiority, but it bleeds more. There's an issue with safety. We looked at 31 subgroups, 27 which were pre-specified and 5 post-hoc analyses, and we found no hint of a difference by subgroup based on patients' characteristics, patient management, prior therapy, etc. So the results are clear and consistent. One of the questions, of course, is, did we get the dose right? And we looked at the low-dose data, and the low-dose data that is depicted here shows that, in fact, the low dose fares slightly worse than control and still has excess bleeding. So it is not a poor selection of the dose, it is actually that the therapy is not more effective than control. Our conclusions are that compared with control and fractionated heparin and eptifibatide, Otamixaban was not superior, as it did not reduce the risk of ischemic outcomes in non-ST elevation ACS patients managed with an invasive strategy. Meanwhile, the risk of major and minor bleeding was approximately doubled with Otamixaban. The results were consistent across patient subgroups, and the lower dose of Otamixaban did not achieve better results. This suggests an unfavorable efficacy-safety balance for acute factor Xa inhibition in the modern era of dual antiplatelet therapy and routine early intervention for ACS. There are a couple of additional lessons that I want to mention. The first one is, I think it's appropriate to remember that small trials are unreliable in their results. And I think it's appropriate that I speak after Dr. Frobert, who did a large trial to test something that had been tested positively in smaller trials prior. Just like for the thrombus aspiration, the Otamixaban phase 2 experience had been extremely positive, and it took a large, well-performed phase 3 trial to really test the hypothesis and find that eventually there was no benefit in this agent. So we need to do appropriately powered studies. The second lesson is related to data that I did not show. We also looked at intraprocedural complications during PCI, which are always a concern with factor Xa antagonists. And you may remember that other factor Xa antagonists have had an excess of thrombotic complications during PCI, and we found no excess of thrombotic complications. And I think there's a good message here for patients who are on oral factor Xa antagonists and need to undergo PCI for ACS, that maybe they are actually protected against thrombosis and may not necessarily require additional anticoagulation at the time of PCI. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Very interesting study. Are there any questions from the audience?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, hello. What implications does this have for fondaparinux? Because I thought that drug had shown a benefit.
Yes. Well, fondaparinux is a different agent. It's a subcutaneous agent. The dose was very different. And fondaparinux has shown a mortality reduction when compared to enoxaparin, not the exact same standard, but has shown increased procedural complications which require that if patients go on to PCI, they actually receive additional anticoagulation with unfractionated heparin, as shown in the OASIS 8 trial. And this is actually one of the shortcomings of fondaparinux, and one of the reasons why fondaparinux is not used or approved in that indication in the United States.
So fondaparinux is very different. It's not approved and indicated in PCI as an agent alone, as Gabriel's saying.
And are there any other factor X agents used in this indication?
Not to the best of my knowledge, no. Not injectable agents for ACS in the acute stage. There have been factor Xa antagonists that have been tested in the post-ACS stage. Apixaban and rivaroxaban have been tested. One successfully rivaroxaban, one unsuccessfully apixaban, but not in the acute injectable form.
Ed Sussman, webpage today. Dr. Steg, do you know what the company's plans are for this agent? Is it going forward, or is it
on
gone?
The very day that these results were announced, Sanofi has discontinued development of this agent. I think the result was clear, and I think we were very disappointed for the product. The company was disappointed, and I think it was not good news for patients either that we could not improve anticoagulation. But I think negative results are important. They advanced the field, and we were able to have a clear result on the hypothesis that was tested. This agent is not better than control.
Gabriel, this has led to some important insights into the role of antiplatelet mechanisms in PCI versus anticoagulation mechanisms after. Do you want to elaborate?
Yes, I think that it is possible that in the modern era where patients go on quickly to PCI after ACS, after admission, the median delay between randomization and angiography was 4 hours. It is possible that maybe anticoagulation is not that important. Maybe at that stage it's antiplatelet therapy that is key. Mm-hmm. And we've seen recently that there are several examples of antiplatelet therapy trials that have shown benefit. In contrast, the anticoagulation trials do not really demonstrate major efficacy differences. There are safety differences, but it looks like the efficacy is somewhat similar regardless of the agent you give.
Okay. So it's telling us something about the underlying biology and mechanisms.
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. Break.
Can you comment on the good results of factor 2A blockers, like bivalirudin in intervention for STEMI of course, is a different situation. There, this anticoagulant was superior to heparin and a 2B3A blocker.
Yes, I think the STEMI situation is slightly different from the non-ST elevation ACS situation, because here you have complete occlusion of the vessel, and therefore re-establishing any flow is critical to the success of intervention. As you point out, the Horizons AMI trial showed a mortality benefit from an anticoagulant, bivalirudin, in a setting of STEMI. And it's interesting that you asked the question, because I'm sure you're aware that we are conducting and finishing a European trial in the ambulance of bivalirudin in STEMI called Euromax. And we are happy to announce that these results will be presented very soon, hopefully as a late breaker at the TCT meeting.
Okay, Gabriel, thank you very much. And now we move to Professor Frans van